Hello, my name is Rodney Bullard, and I'm the Executive Director of the Chick-fil-A Foundation and Vice President of Corporate Social Responsibility at Chick-fil-A. I want to welcome you to the Chick-fil-A Nonprofit Accelerator. As part of the Accelerator, we have the opportunity to speak with legends in the space of nonprofit and heroes around diversity and equity and inclusion. And that's exactly what we're going to get a chance to do today. So I have a wonderful opportunity to speak with Dr. Beverly Tatum, and I will read your biography because I want to make sure that I get it right and I don't miss anything. But it's a pleasure to be with you, my friend.
It's my pleasure.
So many of you all may know Dr. Tatum, but Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, President Emerita of Spelman College, is the author of the best-selling book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race, now in its 20th anniversary edition. A thought leader in higher education, she was the 2013 recipient of the Carnegie Academic Leadership Award and the 2014 recipient of the American Psychological Association Award for Outstanding Lifetime Contributions to Psychology. Dr. Tatum holds a BA degree in psychology from Wesleyan University, a master's and PhD in clinical psychology from University of Michigan, and a master's in religious studies from Hartford Seminary. And one of the things that I didn't mention is that you are the chair of the Westside Future Fund Board, which I think is really relevant to nonprofit leaders here. Can you tell us a little bit about the Westside Future Fund?
Sure. The Westside Future Fund is a not-for-profit organization focused on the revitalization of 4 historic neighborhoods on the west side of Atlanta. Those neighborhoods have been historically under-resourced, largely African-American, with a long history of leadership coming out of those neighborhoods. Most notably, Dr. Martin Luther King lived there, and we often say that the goal of the Westside Future Fund is to help create the kind of community that Dr. King would be proud to call home today.
No, absolutely. Now, we're sitting in an adjacent neighborhood, Adair Park, which is also on the west side here in Atlanta, Georgia. And as I drove in, I couldn't help but notice the changes in the neighborhood. And so one of the things that I know that you think about is gentrification. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I often say our goal is development without displacement, that we know that as resources and investment come into communities, often prices start to rise and people who have been there a long time start to get pushed out. We don't want that to happen. We really want this community and whatever benefits are coming to it to benefit the people who have been here, invested in the community, not just over a lifetime, but perhaps over generations.
Yes.
And so we want to be sure that we can provide and help support the continued high quality, affordable housing. We want to be sure that we are helping to promote safety and security, but also access to high quality education from cradle to career, and to also create an environment working with community members to ensure community health and wellness. So as all of those things are happening, we know there's pressures on pricing. And so one of the first things we did at the Westside Future Fund was to create an anti-displacement tax fund. That is, I think, a very important signature program because what it says is that if you have been a homeowner here and are worried that your taxes are going to rise, your property taxes are going to rise to the point that you can't afford to stay, we are prepared and able, thanks to the philanthropic investment of companies like Chick-fil-A and others, to provide financial assistance to longtime residents to pay the difference between their current taxes and their future taxes.
Yes. You know, one of the things that I know you've been mindful of is just the respect of culture in these neighborhoods. Can you talk a little bit about how you go about respecting those who have been the legacy residents of the neighborhood?
Well, I think there's an expression that says nothing about us without us. And so for us, we have really tried to honor that, to be present and listen to what the needs of the community are, to hear what's important to the current residents, and to work in partnership, not to do to people, but with people.
Yes.
And so as we focus on community revitalization, it's been really important for members of not just our board, but more importantly, the CEO and the staff to attend, for example, the local MPU meetings, to engage in a series, as we did, a series of convenings to hear what people were most concerned about, particularly as we were developing what we now refer to as the Land Use Master Plan, that lays out a framework not just for redevelopment, but really allows neighbors to say, this is what we want our neighborhood to look like. This is what we think is important. No, we don't want high density housing. We want to maintain the structures and the style that are part of our historic communities. And all of that has been the result of careful listening.
Yeah. No, so often in nonprofit work, the constituents or the beneficiaries are people of color.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that's related to geography, sometimes it's related to economics. Can you talk about how what you've learned in Westside Future Fund and your work there, how that relates to other nonprofits and how you respect the beneficiaries and those constituents as well?
Well, I think it's really important to have an understanding of the history of these neighborhoods. And so, when we talk about the fact that these are historically underserved neighborhoods, that they're largely African-American neighborhoods, those two things are not coincidental.
Yes.
We know that these neighborhoods were the result of segregation, where one of the things that's, I think, important to know about the history of the community is that it was a very economically diverse community, so you had faculty members from the AUC and business owners living in the same neighborhoods, perhaps with folks who were working as domestics or as service employees for downtown hotels, that people at varying education levels and income levels were living in close proximity to one another because they were all Black. Yes. And confined in some ways to a particular geographic footprint as part of the public policy and practice for generations, yes. Right? So when opportunities expanded following the success of the civil rights movement, people could move out, people with resources could move out into other parts of the city, and many did, leaving behind vacancies, sometimes a set of neighborhoods that depopulated. And then you find that there are folks still living in the neighborhood, maybe because they couldn't afford to live elsewhere, or perhaps because of their longtime family or community ties, choosing to stay in the neighborhood. But we also know that when neighborhoods are populated largely by African Americans, city investment does not typically follow.
Yeah. I'm going to direct us a little bit back to your book, because I'm curious, with all of your experience, curious what you think about this intersection of race, psychology, and opportunity, particularly now that, someone might be growing up and seeing, or a young child might be growing up and seeing George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery, and how that impacts them from a psychological standpoint, or how it impacts us from the standpoint of how we aspire, what we think we actually can do as people of color or in communities of color.
Yes. Well, I am a psychologist, and my longtime research interest has been on identity development, right? How we come to understand who we are in the world and how other people see us, yes. And how that shapes our interactions with each other. So when we think about the context of racism in our society, we have to acknowledge that part of growing up, particularly for young people of color, is coming to terms with what it means to be part of a racially stigmatized group, right? So if you are a young African-American girl or a young man growing up wondering, what does it mean to be Black in this moment? What does that mean in terms of what other people expect of me? What does that mean in terms of how people will see me, how they treat me? What does that mean in terms of what I hope to do? On the one hand, we, young people coming of age today have had the wonderful experience of seeing Michelle Obama, Barack Obama, the Obama family in the White House, yes. Right? So there's that clear image of success. But they've also seen here in Georgia, a young man like Ahmaud Arbery, yes. out for a Sunday jog being essentially hunted down and killed on a Sunday afternoon, not that far from his own home. And so the contrast, on the one hand, you can be the president. On the other hand, you're still perceived as someone who doesn't belong in certain places, someone who can be snuffed, whose life can be snuffed out as George Floyd's was under the knee of a police officer. These images are painful, and they lead someone to ask, could that be me? Could that be someone I care about, a family member, a friend? And that is something that young people do have to wrestle with, and parents have to wrestle with it as they try to guide their children and leave them with a sense of hope and optimism, and yet also have them understand the threats that continue to be part of everyday reality.
Yes. There is a saying that it takes a village to raise a child. So what obligation does the larger community, what obligation does business have in this conversation as well?
I think there are at least two ways. At first, when you were saying, it takes a village to raise a child, I was thinking about, the ways that each of us can be a role model for somebody.
Yes.
We can mentor someone, we can guide someone, we can offer advice, we can, even just be a presence in a neighborhood. There's research that shows that better outcomes come from kids who grow up in a neighborhood where Black men are present, even just because they see them getting up, going to work every day. I mean, that's a message that conveys positive expectations. But beyond that, when we think about businesses, and often businesses do think about the ways they can mobilize their employees to be active participants in the community. But I think it's also important for businesses to look at what are their policies and practices. Are they paying a living wage?
Yes.
Are they creating pipelines of opportunity for young people and their parents to be successful and able to take care of their own families? Are they speaking up when policies and practices in the community are being debated and providing that kind of leadership? I started to say I'm a relative newcomer to Atlanta. I can't say that anymore. I've been living here almost 20 years.
Yes.
But one of the stories I heard when I came to Atlanta was about the role that Coca-Cola had played. When Dr. Martin Luther King received his Nobel Prize, and there was some discussion about having a dinner to honor him.
Yes.
There were a lot of business people who were still stuck in a kind of segregation mindset and did not want to participate in such an event. And the person who was the head of the Coca-Cola company, I think it was Mr. Woodruff at the time, said, we need to do this. If we can't honor a son of Atlanta who has been such a change agent and who is being recognized on the world stage with this Nobel Peace Prize, then maybe this is not the kind of city that that Coca-Cola wants to be part of. Coca-Cola could be anywhere. We don't have to be here in Atlanta.
That's right.
And after he made that statement, people were knocking down doors to get to that dinner, And so that's what leadership can do, can change behavior, if not hearts and minds. We often think we have to change hearts and minds before we change behavior, but actually a psychologist will tell you that if you change behavior, attitudes will follow.
Yes. It's the power of voice.
Yes.
And I think, there's a voice that businesses have and that businesses have an obligation to use appropriately.
Yes.
Not in every situation, but appropriately. It's also the power of voice that the individual has. You think about Dr. King as a citizen, and then you think about these communities as well. And
yes.
One of the things that you have articulated so well is making sure that these communities have voice.
Yes.
And that their voices are heard as well. And so that's critical. Go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say that in my book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, in the last chapter, I talk about the fact that each of us has a sphere of influence.
Yes.
That we all have the opportunity to not just influence family members and friends, but people in our workplace, people in our social networks, and that when we think about how we can use that sphere of influence to bring about change, we are all more powerful than we might initially think. Often people will say, well, I'm just one person, what can I do? But it is amazing to me that if you focus on your spheres of influence in those around those issues and concerns that are important to you, you can, light the fire under a lot of people in order to get them to think about issues in a new way. And you would be surprised what the ripple effect can be.
Yes, absolutely. As we talk to nonprofit leaders, oftentimes nonprofit leaders, like many leaders, think about their limitations and they say, if only I had more money, if only I had this or that. How can a nonprofit leader really focus and use what you just said for their own organization and the work they're doing?
Well, one of the things I learned in higher education, particularly when I became a president, was that if you have a good idea, you can get the money. And so I used to say to my team, who needs money when you have good ideas? And of course, you do need money to implement. But if you have a vision, if you have something that you can really describe to people in a way that captures their imagination, the mission that you're working toward, the goal that you're trying to achieve in your organization, if you can share that with other people in a way that excites their imaginations, you'll be surprised, but people will start to say, how can I help you? And when they say, how can I help you? That often leads to a conversation that might, in fact, include the addition of resources.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's key. And I know that's something that I hope that nonprofit leaders take from this session and the Nonprofit Accelerator. How can you get your ideas out there? How can you start to crystallize them? Then how can you articulate them in a manner that moves people? And how can you think big? Because sometimes we're thinking too small, and small dreams stir no man's soul. So just the opportunity to think big. You were a prolific fundraiser at Spelman College. Can you talk about, particularly here in Atlanta, the role of HBCUs in Atlanta?
I think the role of HBCUs in Atlanta is so important, and I think sometimes underappreciated. I have been, as I know you have, in meetings, let's say at the Metro Atlanta Chamber of Commerce or other places, where people often tout the diversity of talent in the city of Atlanta. The pipeline of talent that companies are looking for is so readily available here.
Yes.
But one of the reasons it is readily available is because of the Atlanta University Center and other institutions of higher education.
Yes.
But in particular, I'll speak about Spelman. I know it's probably also true for Morehouse and maybe CAU as well. But what I started to say was, at Spelman, our students come from all over the world, right? Certainly across the United States and countries outside the United States as well.
Yes.
But fully a third of them choose to stay in Atlanta. So when we talk about that talent pipeline, what we have to talk about is the way that these institutions serve as a magnet for talent. People come from everywhere because they want to be in school at Spelman, at Morehouse, at CAU, in the Atlanta University Center. And then when they graduate, they often decide, I like Atlanta. I'd like to stay here. And those are the folks that companies are looking to hire,
Yes.
That will have the next big idea or the next leadership expression that we all need. And so I think that is something that we don't always recognize or talk about. Atlanta really is a college town.
It really is.
I grew up in Massachusetts. I moved here from Massachusetts. And when I was living in Massachusetts, I did not think of Atlanta as a college town. You think of Boston as a college town.
Yes, you do.
But you did. I did not have that perspective. But now, having been here, not only seeing the AUC, but also places like Georgia State,
Yes.
Georgia Tech, Kennesaw. I mean, there are many institutions that contribute to the rich educational heritage, but there's no place with a stronger historical legacy of leadership and talent development than the AUC school.
Absolutely. And I asked that question in part because as I think about the leaders listening, what advice would you give them about recruiting and retention and diversity within their recruiting?
Yeah. Well, if you're not recruiting in the AUC, you should be. So let's just start with that. That's as they say, a no-brainer. Yeah. You should be definitely getting to know those communities, getting to know the faculty who teach there, because often faculty are your best, if you're trying to compete with a company everybody's trying to recruit. And if you are trying to compete, having a faculty member who's serving as somebody's advisor say, oh no, you want to work at Chick-fil-A. If you're trying to weigh offers, that kind of endorsement, faculty endorsement from a trusted advisor will certainly help students consider what the options are when companies are trying to get to know those communities, those students. But I would also say, in terms of retention, one of the things that you need to invest in is, you need to do three things. I like to call them the ABCs. You need to affirm identity, you need to build community, you need to cultivate leadership. And the A, affirming identity, really speaks to the fact that we all want to be seen, heard, and understood by someone else. We all want our personhood to be affirmed. And when we enter into spaces, whether that's a new company, a new school, a new community of any kind, we look for ourselves in that environment. I sometimes use the analogy of a photograph. If we were standing in a crowd of a few people, let's say 20 people, we were all together and somebody was taking a group photo. When we got our copy of the picture, the first thing either one of us is going to do is look for ourselves. Yeah. That's exactly, we're going to look for ourselves in that photo. And not only are we going to look for ourselves in the picture, then we're going to evaluate, how do we look? Am I looking good in that picture? We want to see ourselves not just in the picture, but looking good. And if you think about stepping into a new environment, it's like stepping into a photograph. You want to see yourself represented in that photograph and in a way that inspires you, not always at the bottom of the organizational totem pole, but throughout the organization, doing things. People like me are having success here. So what do I see when I step into your organization? And if, because you're just getting started on your diversity journey, if I'm not seeing much, then you have to figure out, how am I going to catch up to the rest of the world? So that, I started to say students, but really anybody entering into your community will say, this is a place where I can feel like I belong, where I can feel like I'm included. And that really brings me to the B, building community. Often we try to build community, a sense of, every leader should be trying to build community where, as I like to say, where you get everybody rowing in the same direction, where you feel like you're all on the same team, working toward the same goal. But some of the things that you might be doing to bring people together, maybe hosting events at the local golf course. Well, that works for the golfers, right? No. But not for the non-golfers.
That's right.
How do we bring people together in a way where everyone can feel connected? Maybe we'll have a volunteer opportunity at the local food bank where everyone can be a part of that process, as opposed to some other kind of activity that leaves people feeling left out. So when we think about the B, we have to be thinking about it in the context of the A. Is my building community activity going to be done in such a way that affirms the identities of all of my participants?
Yes.
And then the C, cultivating leadership, really speaks to the fact that we have a lot of leaders who haven't learned how to do this. And why haven't they? Maybe it's because they grew up in segregated communities. Maybe it's because they went to segregated schools. Maybe it's because they haven't really had the opportunity to test out what's required to create a community that is truly inclusive. And if you find yourself in a leadership role knowing that you have had some gaps in your education, then you have to have some practice or some mentoring from somebody who maybe knows more about it than you do. And being open to that, or having a recognition at the organizational level that we have leaders who need some leadership development opportunities so that they can be more effective. That cultivating of leadership is necessary. And even if you know how to do it, you have to ask, am I passing these skills on to the people below me?
Yes.
You know, are the folks I'm supervising developing that capacity so that when I'm gone or when I'm not here, when I'm doing something else, they still can carry forward that those values, those organizational values that create the kind of place that people want to work, want to stay, want to advance.
Yeah. Well, unpack something you said, because so often I get the question, and I know you get the question as well, from those who are not of color. What can I say? What if I say the wrong thing? What if I do the wrong thing? I feel uncomfortable. How do you help them with that?
Well, one of the things I like to say is that let's imagine you've got a new employee or you're meeting somebody for the first time and their name is unfamiliar to you, meaning you don't know how to pronounce it.
Yes.
Maybe because it's a name that's been creatively put together by a family that is unfamiliar to you. Maybe because it's a language difference. You know, somebody's coming from outside the country and a name that everybody knows back at home and that original home of origin is not so familiar here.
Yes.
For whatever reason, you're looking at this name, you don't know how to pronounce it. It is okay to say, would you say your name for me? I want to be sure I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yes.
You know, what do people do instead? Sometimes they just say, hey, you, right? You know, they try to avoid using the name because they don't know how to pronounce it, which makes somebody feel invisible.
Yes.
Or they might say, your name is too hard. I'm going to call you X. Well, I didn't give you permission to call me X. Or even if I did, it might be because I've gotten used to people not taking the time to learn how to pronounce my name.
Yeah.
So just something as simple as asking, you know, I'm not sure about this. Can I ask you? People will feel usually recognized by that. They'll appreciate the fact that you took the time to inquire. Now, of course, if you ask every time you see them and don't take the time to really practice it and learn it, you know, after a while, the question's going to get old. But the fact that someone wants to be affirming in that way. But if we think about other kinds of situations, like the George Floyd death, right? You know, that was really traumatic for a lot of people. I know people who I don't know well reached out to me to say, I was thinking of you. I wondered how you were doing. Well, on the one hand, that can be nice, but if you weren't wondering how I was doing before, you don't have to wonder about it now, right? You know, if we didn't have a relationship before where you might inquire or check in with me periodically, you don't have to check in now.
Yeah.
But if someone has a work relationship, let's say, you know, we work in the same office, this horrible thing has happened, to be able to say, I was really upset by this. I imagine it was upsetting for you. Is this something you'd be willing to talk to me about? And the person might say, no, I really don't want to talk about it. And that would be to respect that,
Yes.
you know, but at the same time, in an authentic way to say, this is a really difficult time for a lot of people. I'm wondering how it is for you.
I think that's great advice, particularly for leaders who it may be someone without their team, but it may be someone that's also on their team.
Yes.
And would you give the same advice for leaders who have folks who are on their team and how they should care for them in the midst of all that's going on right now?
Well, I think you just hit the nail on the head when you said, how should they care for them?
Yeah.
You know, it is an act of caring to say, you know, I've been thinking about you.
Yes.
You know, I know that this is a tough time for a lot of people. How's it going for you?
Yes.
And particularly if we have this work relationship that is rooted in mutual respect, I would think that would be well received. But on the other hand, sometimes people don't want to talk. Sometimes things are, it makes me so mad that I just can't really talk about it right now. To say, you know, that's okay too. You know, if you need some space, that's okay too. But to let the person you're concerned about tell you what they need and what's helpful.
Yeah.
And even maybe to ask what would be helpful.
Yes, absolutely. And to give that person space, because they may not talk the first time.
Yes.
But they may come around once that trust is built.
Yes,
Relationships are built at the speed of trust.
exactly.
And once that trust is built, then people can come around and have more of a conversation there.
Yes, yes.
You know, one of the things as we close, I want to ask you is why is any of this important? Why is diversity important? Why is difference important? Why should we even have a conversation about this?
Well, we need to have a conversation about difference because difference has become, or has for a long time, not just recently, has been a source of conflict and dysfunction in our society. When we talk about racism, racism's not new. It goes back a long way, and it creates dysfunction. Obviously, it creates a problem for the person who is a target of racism, but it creates a problem for white people, right? A person growing up white in the United States is being injured by racism too. And not because of what people say, we hear that term reverse racism. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the way that racism interferes with our ability to connect with each other. It interferes with our ability to work productively together. It interferes with our ability to be our best, to be the best place we can be as a nation, as a community, as individuals. And so if we want to be at our best, we have to be able to talk about those things that interfere with that.
I love it. I appreciate your time. Is there anything you want to add as we close?
I would simply say, I think I've articulated this in another way, but I just would say in a very direct way, you can't solve a problem you can't talk about. And so it becomes important for all of us to be able to have these conversations if we want to really be at our best.
Absolutely. You can't solve a problem you can't talk about. That's excellent. Thank you, my friend. Thank you for your time.
Oh, it's been my
pleasure. For your
pleasure.
leadership. It's been my pleasure as well.